Good evening, good afternoon. I hope there are no good mornings, but there might be, depending on where you are. On behalf of Truth Defense and Shadow World Investigations, I would like to welcome you to this event on protecting and supporting whistleblowers. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you to our four exceptional speakers who I will introduce individually shortly. My name is Andrew Feinstein. I am the Executive Director of Shadow World Investigations in London. I am also a director, along with Justin Schlossberg, who is also with us, of Truth Defense. Truth Defense is a collective of citizens from many, many walks of life who are all concerned by the increasing use of disinformation, misinformation online, in traditional media, and in political advertising and campaigning. We're also concerned by the increasing use of defamation and other civil and public law procedures for politically motivated purposes, especially in the online sphere, what is sometimes referred to as lawfare. Shadow World Investigations is a small NGO that undertakes path-breaking investigations into cases of grand corruption, corporate malfeasance, and militarism, predominantly, but not exclusively, in the global arms trade. I suppose it's worth mentioning that in a previous life, I was an ANC Member of Parliament in South Africa, where I attempted to investigate a very corrupt arms deal in which around $350 million of bribes were paid to key ministers, senior officials, military leaders, executives of the state arms companies, and assorted insalubrious intermediaries. I'm the author of The Shadow World, Inside the Global Arms Trade, and the film of the same name. I also should mention that I serve on the board of the Platform to Protect Whistleblowers in Africa, a whistleblowing support organization that has supported many whistleblowers across the continent of Africa. I would also like to mention that a Truth Defense and Shadow World Investigations report that was released just a few hours ago, entitled Damage Control: Blowing the Whistle on the Whistleblowing Support Industry. You can see that report on the Truth Defense website, on the Twitter feed, and similarly on the Shadow World Investigations website and Twitter feed. The report outlines the crucially important role that whistleblowing as a public good should play in our societies. The crucial role that it plays in exposing systemic corruption, be it in the banking sector, massive offshore tax evasion, expansive state surveillance regimes, the true human cost of wars that are very seldom documented, and abuses of power of all kinds and in all types of organizations and institutions. In an age when corporate and government business is increasingly conducted without any formal paper trail, the act of truth-telling by insiders is more essential than ever in order to meaningfully hold the powerful to account. But this fundamental democratic and public interest function of whistleblowing is under threat. Since 2010, both the US and UK governments have adopted increasingly reactionary and repressive measures in a bid to contain and deter whistleblowing, especially from within the military and security state. Both countries have been accused by UN officials of treatment amounting to torture. As mentioned, we have four truly remarkable speakers this evening. And first off, we have Eileen Chubb, who will talk about the enormous pressures on whistleblowers. Eileen, who runs Compassion and Care, which was founded in 2003 for healthcare whistleblowers. I came across her in an organization called Whistleblowers UK, which was supposed to be set up for whistleblowers in all sectors, including the healthcare sector, which Eileen had been so involved in. It was set up by a wonderful man who is greatly missed today, Gavin McFadden. And Eileen and Gavin, being people of principle, of integrity, at a moment decided to leave Whistleblowers UK and to create another organization for the broader whistleblowing community called The Whistler. These two organizations have supported over 9,000 whistleblowers to date. And to give us some sense of that experience and of the extreme difficulties that face whistleblowers in our society, I'm going to hand over with gratitude and with great respect to Eileen.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you. The report that you've done today, which is amazing, and I urge people to read it. The shocking truth about what goes on and really how government is committed to protecting whistleblowers, which is not at all. So thank you. I'd like to thank all those whistleblowers who came forward and gave evidence. Many of those people had already been through hell and had their trust destroyed by their employers, and to have come forward and given evidence about what's in this report, I know how much courage that took. I especially like to thank Tracy Austin, in particular, Duke of York whistleblower, who had the most contact with the Whistleblowers UK and was harmed the most because of that. Exactly 22 years ago today, I blew the whistle on abuse in a Bupa care home. The Bupa 7 case was the first case to use the UK law on whistleblowing PIDA, and it was the first case to be failed by the UK law PIDA. All of these failures were brought to the attention of Parliament. Our MP, who at the time was brilliant, called for a public inquiry. The government declined to act, and we've seen 22 years of whistleblowing injustice as a result. The current law was written by an organisation that is more grounded in compliance, or the containment industry, as we call them. Then, you know, it was never really written to be robust enough to go into a courtroom, and that's quite clear, and it was quite clear from the beginning. Things have gotten much, much worse since then, because the issue of whistleblowing has actually been hijacked by lobbyists, and justice for whistleblowers has been hijacked by people who can pay the highest price for their own agenda to be put forward in law, rather than what's needed by whistleblowers. What can we say about, we've raised numerous concerns about APPGs in general, and I'm not saying all APPG or party parliamentary groups are bad, because many of them are not, but the actual rules that apply are so lax that it allows widespread abuse to take place, so that you end up with a situation where, you know, the media receive a press release from a parliamentary group that says this, this, and this about whistleblowing, and that's taken at face value because it's from a parliamentary group. They must know what they're talking about, and that's the worrying thing, is the public trust and the public being misled by information that's been put out. Very early on, we were raising concerns that the data contained in these reports wasn't right. It didn't tie in with the average whistleblowing data that we have, and we've been doing this a long time. The kinds of things that were being reported were all out of sync with, you know, what's normally acceptable as whistleblowing issues. So that was, you know, first things that came on, you know, our radar. As time went on, we started to receive a considerable amount of whistleblowers contacting our helpline who'd previously contacted Whistleblowers UK. And we started seeing a theme that, where cases were being cherry-picked based on how much the whistleblower was earning. So those whistleblowers from the front line weren't even called back. So you've got people that can be suicidal, whose lives have been destroyed because they did the right thing, and they're not even called back. And that enrages me, to be quite honest. I will never apologise for being angry about this issue, because to me, caring for whistleblowers is a duty of care. There's a duty of care because you've got people's lives in your hands, and you've got the lives of those they're trying to protect in your hands as well. And I never underestimate that responsibility, because it's a heavy weight to carry, and you cannot just ignore people's concerns because their cases don't reflect the agenda that you have. It became very clear early on that Whistleblowers UK were pro-bounty. Now, bounty hunting is not whistleblowing, because it just takes the public interest element out of the whole agenda, and you can't have whistleblowing without serving public interest. I won't go too far into that, but what happened was we reported these concerns to all the relevant authorities, the Treasury Department, FCA, the Biz Department. We went everywhere. We went to the APPG, we went to Parliamentary Standards. We never left any stone unturned, because, you know, it was only a matter of time before I received the news that a whistleblower had taken their life because they were failed by Whistleblowers UK. And I'm not having that happen on my watch, basically. What was staggering for us was, as a result of raising these valid concerns, which were robustly evidenced, we were targeted with a campaign of malicious allegations by Whistleblowers UK. In effect, the Secretariat of the APPG on whistleblowing behaved exactly the same as the worst employer would behave when concerns are raised in the workplace. I mean, it was absolutely horrendous. They used the ICO, they used the regulator, the Charity Commission, and the real core of what they were complaining about was the book There Is No Me in Whistleblower, which is the case for Edna's Law, and they wanted Edna's Law deleted. They wanted to stop both of those things continuing. And they used regulators to further that agenda. And incredibly, the Charity Commission currently was under the remit of Baroness Stowell, who is politically linked to the complainant, being from the same party. Her appointment to the Charity Commission was robustly opposed at the time. Her agenda with the Charity Commission has been trying to gag charities from, you know, campaigning or saying anything about issues that affect their beneficiaries, such as, in our case, things that affect whistleblowers would be things like free speech. Baroness Stowell has actually said charities shouldn't be speaking out on things like free speech, which is staggering. So you've got a situation where charities have either got to protect themselves in order to keep their funding. We have no paid staff, but we have to have a minimum of 10K a year to survive. And even though we've got no paid staff and we're tiny, we were put in a position where the Charity Commission have actually tried to censor our website. And of course, we will not give an inch on this. We will not. We will fight this no matter what. And if a regulator can be misused to that extent by a parliamentary secretariat to remove any political obstruction to their agenda, that is quite a chilling thing to happen in what's supposed to be a free country. Libel law. Libel law is currently being widely misused. Now, Whistleblowers UK threatened our publisher with libel because of the book There Is No Me in Whistleblower. It's not libelous at all. Everything in it is fully backed up with documentation. However, if you've threatened a charity with libel, the Charity Commission can sanction that charity regardless. Just making the threat of libel is a way to silence any opposition. And that has got to be changed. That is totally wrong, because you're going to end up with a situation where campaigners and charities won't speak out on really important issues because they've been threatened with libel and as a tactic, and that's wrong. So I think what the core of everything that's wrong with this country is the fact that we've got whistleblowing law and we've got people in the system that are not abiding with the rule of law. the rule of law has been abandoned as far as we're concerned in the UK. It's not the country I thought I lived in or thought I was born in. So that's one thing that's got to change. So at a time when we were dealing with a 60% increase in helpline calls from whistleblowers across the country during the COVID pandemic, Whistleblowers UK targeted this charity via the Charity Commission. The only people who suffered as a result of those attacks were the whistleblowers we were trying to help. And I'm eternally grateful to the amazing whistleblowing volunteers that we have and to the trustees of this charity, because as a whistleblower, this charity started with, as a whistleblower, there was no one to help us. So, we didn't want anyone else to go through that, and we tried to help others. Those others have tried to help others. And this amazing network of goodwill and incredible integrity has sprung up all over the UK through Compassion and Care and the Whistler. We have teachers that help whistleblowers in the care sector who can't write out their concerns because they're not literate in English. And, we've got teachers that will help them. And then we've got police officers that will help families that are trying to raise concerns about abuse. So we have all of this expertise and all of this goodwill that's given freely, and the idea that anyone could see a whistleblower and see money to be made. So that was the big thing. So we are currently fighting the Charity Commission, and we will continue to fight, them, because everything that we stand for, truth, integrity, and honesty, is paramount. And we publish all our evidence. It's all evidence based. And we serve whistleblowers and we serve the defenceless who rely on whistleblowers. The whistleblowing APPG, all of the members, I don't count Norman Lamb in this because he's the only one that's had integrity, but every single member of the APPG was written to and informed of Whistleblowers UK's conduct against this charity and making malicious allegations, threatening some of our vulnerable volunteers with police action, and a whole stream of troll accounts with awful threatening tweets. That's the kind of the behaviour that was going on. And and this is an organisation that's then saying that they're there to stand up for whistleblowers. So I've got to say, the APPG on whistleblowing are telling employers how they should act when they're confronted with concerns. How did the APPG on whistleblowing act when they were confronted with evidence concerns? They ignored them completely. They haven't answered a single correspondence, nothing. Why is whistleblowing so important? Well, in every single sector in this country alone, I mean, at any one time in the care industry, up to 1 million people are estimated to be abused at any one time. 1 million people. The only thing that stands between that abuse and people being safe is the whistleblower. And if you multiply that to the transport industry across the board, it's the difference between life and death. Yet we have a parliamentary system that allows a gravy train of dishonesty to run like rats through a sewer in our democratic system that's supposed to be listening to whistleblowers. I mean, it's absolutely staggering, and I've got to admit I am still shocked by it. And maybe if I gave this as a plot to a Hollywood writer, they'd say that can't happen. It's too far-fetched. We can't make a film out of that. However, that's why we campaign for Edna's Law. Edna's Law is based on the evidence of 9,000 whistleblowers. It's what they've told us they wanted to happen. And that's the key thing. Whistleblowers UK campaign for Office for the Whistleblower. They say they've consulted whistleblowers on this law. However, this law was written years and on their website before they carried out any consultation whatsoever. Whistleblowers want action on the wrongdoing. They want the wrongdoing stopped. And that's why we campaign for Edna's Law, because we won't make a penny from Edna's Law, and nor do we want to. We want to ensure that Edna's Law is brought in, we oversee that it's being done properly, and we're going to fold as a charity, because we're not in here to promote ourselves or to keep ourselves in work. We're here to fix the problem. And the Charity Commission think that's some kind of alien concept, that a charity would try to not, serve itself above those who it's supposed to be serving. So Edna's Law has an inbuilt scrutiny system. We currently waste billions every year on regulators that have no investigation skills. Many of them collude with the wrongdoers. They're absolutely a waste of space, tick listing. And to be quite honest, that money could be put into a police unit. We want a public interest crimes unit. And there's an inbuilt scrutiny system with Edna's Law. We don't just presume people will do what they're supposed to do. So it's, everything is scrutinised every single step of the way. And that's all laid out in the book, There Is No Me in Whistleblower. We want all whistleblowers equally protected. There's so many people saying, oh, well, we want to protect NHS whistleblowers, or we want to protect banking whistleblowers. But the rule of law says that all whistleblowers should be protected equally. Now, we understand that, security whistleblowers, they're never going to allow that. But we've submitted that there should be a public interest defence, and there should be a hearing by a jury and not a judge alone, because the jury is the greatest safeguard we have. So all whistleblowers protected equally. There's a paper trail, and there's a time limit on each type of disclosure and how long the employer has to act. For example, the time frame for the Zeebrugge ferry disaster, to stop ferry sailing from the time a concern was raised, would be 1 hour. And if the employer fails to act within 1 hour, because after all, that's just a phone call, then they are committing a criminal offence, and they will go to prison for failing to act on those kind of concerns. And we perceive that a deterrent will not need to constantly be used. The whistleblower is treated as a protected witness. The state takes the case. The whistleblower is awarded compensation, just compensation, and the employer goes to prison if they fail to act. Whistleblowing is a life and death issue, and it's only if your life depends on it, or you think about it, you realise how important it is. And yet we're having an APPG on whistleblowing that's selling justice for whistleblowers to the highest bidder, to have a gravy train of preferred law firms who will rake in God knows how much money. And we have a compliance industry making billions out of this misery. And I have whistleblowers today who have no food for their children because they did the right thing. So you will understand why I find it reprehensible what Whistleblowers UK and this APPG have done. In fact, when it comes to lobbying, the actions of Whistleblowers UK make the David Cameron lobbying case look like Mary Poppins. And I think that this needs to be totally exposed. And I am so grateful to Truth Defence and to Shadow World for what they've done, because these kind of issues rarely get out there without such amazing people as Andrew and Justin. And we owe you a debt of thanks for all of the whistleblowers. I've been having messages all day, and I expect I'll be having them all night as well from whistleblowers who are, amazingly grateful for what you've done. And, I think as well is the fact that who would want to be a whistleblower? You don't choose to do that. My father was a whistleblower before they invented whistleblowing. And I can remember as a child that he was blacklisted from the construction work. And, I can remember the wrongdoing he reported. He saw a young man killed in a ditch beside him for the want of health and safety. And I can see, I was old enough, being 5 or 6, to remember the price that he paid for that. He had to go and find work in a different job. He could no longer work in construction. These things and this integrity of whistleblowers that I speak to every day, they inspire us to fight and to do everything we can to help them. And in all honesty, I know that Edna's law is the only thing that will change things. Edna was abused as a child. She was one of the Deepa 7 abuse victims. She had no family, and we dedicate the law to her, because when we get the victims of silence at the heart of the law and make sure that that is always foremost in the legal process, that their voices are heard, then we might see something close to justice. We also want all historic whistleblowing cases reopened, examined and heard by a jury. We're very pro-jury, because whilst they're not perfect, they're the greatest safeguard we have in our legal system, and that's why we want whistleblowing cases heard by a judge and a jury. If anyone thinks a jury is not going to make any difference, I'd say Clive Ponting, which is everything that a jury should be. So I think Edna's law is the only way, because there's a paper trail. You haven't got this situation where whistleblowers are accused of not really whistleblowing, and they just said that now, and there was no whistleblowing, and all the smearing and all of the tactics that are used. And one of the greatest things that stops whistleblowing is about the wrongdoing, and I think that's been lost along the way, and especially with this APPG and whistleblowing. They see a whistleblower and they see a profit margin. We see a whistleblower and we see the lives behind the whistleblower that rely on that whistleblower's message being heard. Currently, they drowned, and the message drowns with them. Most whistleblowers never make it into the legal system, because they never saved up before they report the abuse. And most whistleblowers are not in senior positions. They're in low-paid jobs. They're care workers. We don't get headmasters. We get teachers or classroom assistants. We don't get consultants very often. We get cleaners and hospital porters and people on the front line, people that, can't, they've got no buffer, so they've got no savings. That's why their courage is all the more incredible. And that's why Whistleblowers UK's treatment of them is all the more reprehensible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eileen, for that incredibly heartfelt, lived experience account of whistleblowing in the UK today. And I think we all owe you, your two organizations, and the work that you have all done over many years, an enormous debt of gratitude. And I think it's absolutely clear in the comments that have come up as you've been speaking, the respect in which you are held by so many people. We're fortunate to have people from all over the United Kingdom who've joined us today, a number of them whistleblowers themselves, who have sometimes had bad experience in looking for support, but have often found help and assistance through Eileen's organizations. And it certainly comes out in the comments and the respect with which you are held. So thank you so much for that. We also have people from as far afield as Spain and South Africa, and of course the US. So for your benefit, if I could just clarify, the APPG that Eileen was talking about is something called the All-Party Parliamentary Group. These are groups that are established in the British Parliament on specific issues, and there is an APPG on whistleblowing. The report that we published a few hours ago raises some of the concerns that Eileen was voicing around the APPG, its links to Whistleblowers UK, a lack of transparency about the funding and financing of the organization and the APPG, a real concern that some of the support and financing seems to come from for-profit firms who stand to benefit from certain types of whistleblowing, and that Whistleblowers UK, together with these firms and more the APPG itself, are promoting what one would describe as a commercialized or corporatized approach to whistleblowing, what some in the comments have referred to as bounty hunting, where the prime objective seems to be some sort of settlement or payout to the whistleblower. But unfortunately, there are always others around the whistleblower who benefit at times inappropriately from these potential monetized forms of whistleblowing. So please do refer to the report for more detail on these concerns that I've mentioned and that Eileen spoke to so movingly. I think given the global pandemic that we have all been going through for so long now, with such profound disruptions to daily lives, with extraordinary numbers of deaths, the importance of whistleblowing in the care sector and the healthcare sector in particular has probably never been more important. So I cannot commend compassion and care more fulsomely. I think that you have done extraordinary work historically, but perhaps some of your most important work is still to come. And again, judging by some of the comments we've seen by people who work in the sector, there remains an enormous amount to do with respect to the healthcare sector, particularly in the United Kingdom. And I wouldn't be surprised if this was the case in a number of other jurisdictions as well. The other area in which whistleblowing plays a crucially important life or death role, as Eileen has described it, is obviously the defense and national security sector. National security is often used as a reason for secrecy. I've experienced that in my own work, where national security imposed secrecy often provides a veil around what is nothing more than criminal conduct, massive corruption and bribery in the global arms trade, which accounts for 40% of all bribery in all world trade. And we have a number of speakers to speak to that topic tonight. The first of whom is Matt Kennard. And I'm just wondering, Matt, I know that Gavin McFadden, who we mentioned earlier, has played a very important role in your career. I think it might even be possible that the first time you and I met might have been through Gavin. It was Gavin who got me involved in Whistleblowers UK and who contacted me when he and Eileen decided to leave the organization after its then chair had refused to support Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning, arguing that they should simply have gone up the chain of command to report the terrifying abuses that they so bravely brought to public attention. And I think all of the next three speakers will understand how inimical that was to the process of whistleblowing, and why Eileen and Gavin, as people of integrity, had little choice but to leave and to form their own organization. Matt is, in my opinion, one of the UK's leading investigative journalists. I would describe him in the best possible terms as a campaigning journalist. He is the co-founder and a senior investigative journalist with Declassified UK, which he co-founded with Mark Curtis. And in my opinion, Declassified is doing far and away the best work on UK foreign and defense policies and practices, on British intelligence, surveillance, and the remarkably corrupt and out of control British arms trade. Matt is also the author of two books, Irregular Army and The Racket. And I'm really delighted that we have one of the country's finest journalists, to talk to us on this topic tonight. Thanks, Matt.
Can you hear me? Yeah. I mean, firstly, I'd like to just say, I know it's a cliche, but how honored I am to be on this panel, because everyone on the panel I admire greatly. Eileen's work has been an inspiration for a long time. The example set by people like Andrew and Tom as well, in going against these huge institutions to reveal the truth and to reveal injustice. There's nothing more inspiring for me personally, and I think for a lot of people, than seeing people risk everything to get the truth out and to get justice. So, and I think that goes to the heart of what we're talking about today. And I wanted to talk about whistleblowing in quite general terms, because I think democracy cannot exist in a real sense without whistleblowing. And that includes whistleblowers from the national security state, but across all of government, because governments exist largely to lie to their populations, because their populations, they don't want that, they have different interests to their populations, so they have to put out a lot of propaganda to keep their population in line. And the biggest threat to those narratives staying robust is whistleblowers revealing the truth. So that is why you see every day more and more attacks on whistleblowers, and more examples being made of people who have stuck their neck out to get the truth out. And I think that in an information age, which we're living in now, where it is possible to get large quantities of information out to the world, Western states particularly, which is what I'm looking at, see leaks as a very, very big strategic threat. The UK military is constantly building up its cyber warfare department, constantly building up its programs against disinformation, which are murky and I believe purposefully ambiguous about what they target. And this is all about trying to control the narrative in a situation where information is freer than it's ever been. So in that context, whistleblowers, like people like Tom, Edward Snowden, they pose a huge threat, because what they're revealing is truth about these institutions that really undermines the propaganda that these institutions put out about what they do. And our government do not want us to have a realistic view of what they do. They want us to have the sanitized version, which is what they get in the media. And another part of this is an attack on journalists on the other end, because traditionally what's happened in the 20th century, at least, what usually happened in terms of a national security leak would be a source or the leaker was criminalized. That was always the case. So someone like Edward Snowden or Daniel Ellsberg would get prosecuted, but the journalist end never was criminalized. And what you're seeing across the Western world, particularly I look at the US and the UK, is that they're trying to criminalize that journalist end of this leak dynamic, and that's hugely worrying. I mean, the perfect example of that is what's happened to Julian Assange, because Julian Assange created technology and an organization which was aimed at making it easy for whistleblowers of conscience to get their information out into the world. Firstly, without being prosecuted themselves by doing it anonymously, and secondly, because they could rely on WikiLeaks to publish always if it was in the public interest. So, and what you see done to Assange is what they'd like to do to any journalist that helps these leaks that damage the strategic interests of these states. And in fact, there's actual talk now in the UK of an Espionage Act being enacted, which would emulate what the Espionage Act in the US, which was put down in law in 1917 as a way of as a piece of legislation against spies during wartime, but has been subsequently used against leakers of conscience, including Thomas Drake. So what you're seeing in the UK is, I think the national security state thinks, well, we can't allow this to keep happening. We have to have a deterrent in place for journalists, not just the leakers, and make them scared. And they actually, there was a commission called the Law Commission a couple of years ago, which was entrusted by the government to come up with recommendations on updating the law around leaks and national security. And their recommendation was to criminalize the handling of classified information if you didn't have the required access. So that what that would do is mean any journalist in possession of material which is classified and leaked to them by a leaker of conscience would be breaking the law. And of course, that would basically eliminate national security reporting as a pursuit that we can do in the UK. And that is what they want. They don't want information getting out that makes them look bad or makes their strategic priorities obvious. And what alongside this, you've seen a massive backlash against the media, which previously did provide a portal for leakers to go to. So, for example, in the case of Edward Snowden, there was basically he couldn't rely on any newspaper in the Western world, major one, to publish his leaks, apart from the Guardian, really. And it's unclear what would have happened if he hadn't gone through Glenn Greenwald. If he'd gone to someone else, it might not have happened. But we've done some work on this. What you saw in the aftermath of the Snowden revelations was a massive backlash by the national security state against the Guardian to try and neutralize them as a place where these leakers could go. And that took the form of actually entering GCHQ, the Signals Intelligence Agency of the UK, entering the offices of the Guardian and overseeing their reporters smashing up the laptops with the Snowden materials. It's the kind of thing you'd expect to see in somewhere like China, but we saw it in the heart of London. And they did that. There's all sorts of mechanisms they use to co-opt journalists to stop them being receptacles for people of conscience within the national security state. And I think it's worked. There's a thing called the D-Notice Committee as well, which is a committee which sits every 6 months at the Ministry of Defence, which is a collection of security officials and a collection of prominent journalists. And they basically talk amongst each other about what articles they can and can't publish. In the aftermath of Snowden, The Guardian put their first person on the D-Notice Committee. It was actually the deputy editor, Paul Johnson, who was one of the people that had smashed up the laptops. So it was all part of this program of bringing the Guardian in-house and making sure something like Snowden can never happen again. And I think it's quite clear to a lot of people what's happened to the Guardian in the subsequent period. And I think they successfully neutralized the Guardian as a place for national security leakers to go. So what are you left with? You've got Assange in jail, the Guardian neutralized. I think now, if someone like Snowden came along and was looking for a newspaper to go to, there wouldn't be anywhere to go. Or at least there wouldn't be anywhere to go where you could really be sure that they wouldn't go to the authorities first. So the national security state has successfully hit back against whistleblowers. And I think that is one of the major dynamics you're seeing in the information age is states understanding that their purported belief in a free press and their purported belief or stated belief that they want to protect whistleblowers puts them at risk, and they must neutralize the avenues through which this kind of leak can be done. I wanted to just talk briefly about a few cases where we've dealt with whistleblowers. One, and also the term whistleblower, I think it's a great term, which carries a lot of what for me admiration when I speak to a whistleblower. But I think it's not just about people within institutions that reveal information or disclose or come out with information that they shouldn't. There's many different types of whistleblowing. I think whistleblowing in a way is about going against your institution or leaving an institution and understanding how things work or in a real way. Because one of the major things about institutional thinking and why whistleblowing doesn't happen as much as it should is that institutions are built to break people down and to make and ingrain in them certain corporate or state ideologies. So a lot of these people who spend decades within institutions are heavily indoctrinated, and that's why when you see people come out on the other side, the freest minds I've ever seen are whistleblowers, because you see that they just shed all this ideology which they built up over years, and they can see the world clearly, and there's nothing holding them back. So it's across all of society. There was a case in the UK of a UK soldier, Ahmed al-Batati, who wait one sec, sorry, my son's just coming. Ahmed al-Batati, who was a UK soldier who did a protest outside the Ministry of Defence in 2021. Sorry, I'm just gonna, Andrew, can you?
Absolutely.
I don't know if you can hear my son crying. Anyway, so Ahmed al-Batati, I can continue now, I think. He made a statement outside the Ministry of Defence against the war in Yemen, which gosh, I'm gonna have to go. Sorry, can I come back in a sec?
Sure, absolutely. Can I just say at this point, if you haven't read Declassified UK, please do. Just search Declassified UK. It currently is off a South African online publication called the Daily Maverick, but it really is an exceptional publication. While we're waiting for Matt to come back, I just wanted to ask my fellow director at Truth Defense, Justin Schlossberg, whether there is anything, Justin, you would like to just add at this point, coming out of the report about concerns that we have about the nature of the type of whistleblowing support that we are seeing in the UK at the moment.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think one of the things that's interesting, building on the comments from both Eileen and Matt, and what's in our report, is that there is a real kind of political economy of the whistleblowing support industry that really quite, in a quite almost seamless way, integrates the interests specifically of the state in containing and deterring certain forms of whistleblowing, particularly those from the national security state, obviously. But I think also more generally, there is obviously an interest in the state in containing and deterring whistleblowing that exposes any kind of systemic failure within government and probably more widely within the public sector. And then, of course, you have the commercial interests of employers and private organizations in the private sector who similarly share an interest in containing whistleblowing, or at least doing their utmost to prevent disclosures becoming public. And the way in which these kind of, if you like, two sides of the coin have co-opted what I would call the sort of the third sector, the non-profit sector of whistleblowing, is really something that I think is of grave concern, and which is what our report speaks to. And when you have a situation where a whistleblower faces potentially the full wrath of the state, as you know, certainly people like Tom can attest to, or indeed their private organization, where they face the loss of, potentially the permanent loss of their livelihoods, their careers, and sometimes, of course, even worse than that, their safety, their well-being, their mental health. The only place that they have to turn to are those organizations that claim to be not-for-profit, that claim to champion their cause in the public good. And when those organizations lack the kind of transparency that we've seen in regards to Whistleblowers UK, I think and then you mix that with the interests of hugely profitable companies, both in the legal and compliance sectors, who profit directly or indirectly off whistleblowing, and the way in which they have been engaged with organizations like Whistleblowers UK and the APPG. And you get almost a kind of perfect picture where the discourse around whistleblowing, certainly the policy discourse around whistleblowing, leads us to believe that governments and these sorts of organizations and these companies are all batting for the cause of whistleblowing, that they think it's essentially a good thing, and what a great thing to have this brilliant whistleblowing hotline system in your organization to ensure that people can blow the whistle internally before it ever gets out of hand. I'm not saying that those kinds of services don't do some real good and don't really do benefit some types of whistleblowing, but when you think about the kinds of disclosures that are about systemic wrongdoing, systemic failures in organizations, institutional corruption, the likes of which we've seen very recently in this country, in the banking sector, in the media sector, the arms trade, many other sectors, it's just self-evidently pointless to even attempt to blow the whistle internally, because you know that not only are your employers, and by definition the senior management of your organization, complicit in the very wrongdoing that you're trying to expose, but very often and more than likely the regulators or ombudsman may be either tacitly, consciously, unconsciously complicit in it to some degree as well. And not only that, there is the point, as I think Matt was alluding to, that in a democracy, the public has a fundamental right to know when these kinds of systemic, ethical, or criminal sometimes transgressions are happening, particularly when they're within the state or the public sector, but also in many cases in the private sector. Right. And then the last point is, not only do the public need to know, but only by making them public does anything ever really happen as a result in terms of meaningful accountability or reform.
Thanks so much for that, Justin. While Matt deals with the situation at home, we're going to move on to someone who can talk both from their academic background, but more importantly, from their activist role about the issues that Justin has just spoken about. Dr. Deepa Govindaran Driver is an academic and an activist. She's also a trade unionist, a member of the National Executive Committee of the University and College Union. She is chair of Camden Momentum. She is an elected member of the executive of the Haldane Society of Socialist Lawyers and the steering committee of the Labour Campaign for Free Speech. In her day job, Deepa is a university lecturer teaching financial regulation and corporate governance, which is also extremely germane to this topic. Her research interests are in state and corporate accountability. I got to know Deepa through her remarkable role in focusing on and galvanizing the response to the appalling persecution of Julian Assange. And in fact, Deepa served as a legal observer at Julian's trial for the Haldane Society. Deepa.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks very much for allowing me to speak to everybody. And firstly, I'd like to thank those in the audience who have sent their solidarity to other whistleblowers and to Chelsea, Julian and Edward Snowden. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the case of Julian Assange and also about what WikiLeaks did for whistleblowers and why it was important and why it is that what is happening to Julian now is really important if you're an activist campaigning on NHS issues, on issues related to care homes, on issues related to environmental degradation, on issues related to corruption, on issues related to the arms trade. I'd like to start by taking you to the case of a German citizen by the name of Khaled El-Masri. Khaled El-Masri was on holiday and was abducted while on the Macedonian border. He was shackled, hooded, sodomized, severely beaten up by those who abducted him. He was then rendited to a CIA black site in Afghanistan where months of torture continued, at which point the CIA suddenly realized that this was a case of mistaken identity. Now, rather than release Mr. El-Masri, having what he describes as completely destroyed him as a person, they continued to hold him in captivity while they argued about who would take responsibility for what had happened to him. Mr. El-Masri was then dumped on the Albanian border, where he was picked up by Albanian police and repatriated back to Germany. Now, at this stage, you would expect that Mr. El-Masri would get some support from the German government. People weren't believing him. His family had left Germany and gone back to Lebanon, thinking he had abandoned them because this was 7 months later. And instead, the United States put pressure on the German government not to allow Mr. El-Masri to get any justice. In fact, when his case went up to the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights, what really helped him was information that came out from WikiLeaks releases that showed what had been done to him. And through all this time, a lot of diplomatic pressure was put on the Germans not to hold the 13 CIA officers to account, with references being made to any attempts to either arrest or extradite those CIA officials would be seen very negatively by the US. And it is easy to think that Mr. El-Masri's case was, a one-off case, or maybe, it happens from time to time that there is police brutality or there is military intelligence push the boundaries a bit, and occasionally they get the wrong person, but in general, they do the right thing. But as the murder of George Floyd has shown, as the case of Mr. El-Masri has shown, but also as the underreporting of 15,000 deaths in Iraq has shown, as John Sloboda of Iraq Body Count, which is a civil society organization looking at the civilian death toll in Iraq, has testified to this. Governments repeatedly cover up serious and systemic criminality and brutality. And we see this in Abu Ghraib prison and the torture of people there. We see this in Iraq. We see this in Afghanistan. And what is really a living example of this, of how the United States uses legal arbitrage to prevent people getting due process, to prevent people even getting basic rights within the US Constitution, is alive and kicking in Guantanamo today, where 780 odd men, all of Muslim origin, suffered untold horrors, absolutely despicable treatment, rectal feeding of peanuts and pasta, waterboarding, beatings, excessive sensory deprivation for prolonged periods of time, threats to have their family raped, murdered, tortured. That still exists to this day. And then the United States and Britain, who are its ally in war, go around the world telling other countries how to deal with human rights violations. And this is a joke. This is a travesty. And in this context, you also, not only did you have these horrendous wars, you also had a context where the media had changed in that it was moving away from print media. It was moving to very oligopolistic structure of ownership with a few very powerful people controlling the media and controlling the acceptable range of dissent, what we call the Overton window. So you can say a few things, but don't go beyond these boundaries. And then in addition to that, you have a news cycle which puts pressure on journalists to have soundbite type information. And add to all this absolutely intense pressure within organizations, particularly the military, with the help of PR companies and consultants and advisors, to suppress examples of wrongdoing, to actively plant misinformation that misdirects attention, particularly by smearing whistleblowers, by smearing journalists who cover important stories, by undermining and cutting through technology, which would allow people to have some amount of privacy. All this is going on. And here you have this revolution brought about by Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, which was to allow us to surveil the state. Secondly, to allow whistleblowers to provide information securely, not just securely for themselves and anonymously for themselves, because we don't want to have the Chelsea Mannings and the Edward Snowdens and the Tom Drakes of this world suffering. They also allowed for the security of the document itself. And not only was there security of the document through this brilliant new innovation at the time, which was this electronic Dropbox, which I think 23 other whistleblowing organizations and a large number of the world's newspapers now use, a secure Dropbox encrypted facility. You also had the situation, as Matt said earlier, of WikiLeaks being a censorship-resistant platform. What do I mean by this? When the CIA says, we don't like this leak, take this down, WikiLeaks says, no, we won't. It's true. And to this day, they have a 100% accuracy record. So what is put on the WikiLeaks site is something you can trust, unlike the fake news we see all around us today, the manipulations. They disintermediated this news from the journalists in some ways, in that people could look at the source data, they could look at the journalistic information, because WikiLeaks partnered with the largest organizations like the Washington Post or the New York Times or the Guardian on the big stories, so you could have analysis, but you could also see the source data, which was a lot of academic rigor. But also, if you came back to that information, having received some other information from the Freedom of Information Request, you could make sense of it. So if you were a researcher, if you were somebody who had been affected like Mr. El-Masri had, you could look at the data. You didn't have to rely on the self-censorship or the news cycle for your case to be known. WikiLeaks also partnered with very small organizations like Al-Akbar in order to allow stories which were relevant to smaller countries and to different regions to be firstly vetted, but also understood by their local population. Therefore, they allowed for the bits of the Arab Spring, which means they were hugely important in allowing democratic oversight of the government. Because what do governments and many of these security services try to do? They try to put up walls, as do corporations, which are largely sociopathic in the way they engage. They try to put up walls to prevent us from understanding what's happening behind closed doors. And unfortunately, it is us as stakeholders, as members of society, who actually suffer when corporations do something wrong. And we bear the costs, and many of these costs, whether to whistleblowers or to people like Edna or to people like you and me, are not counted in any balance sheet anywhere. So we pay huge prices, and the public pays a huge price, and society pays a huge price, while a small number of people benefit. People like Tony Blair, who is a war criminal, benefit because they now go jetting around the world, earning big bucks, pretending to be motivational speakers and Middle East peace envoys after causing the destruction of the Middle East. So WikiLeaks brought power back to the people, and it brought a certain sense of confidence, a certain sense of trust in the media, which had been irrevocably irrevocably broken by the fact that, for example, the collateral murder video, which YouTube is currently censoring by forcing you to put in all kinds of details before you get to see it, where an Apache gunship was shooting down civilians as though it was some kind of video game. In this kind of information, a journalist who was embedded within the very battalion which was involved in it didn't report, but later told in his book, Chelsea Manning says he must have known. And so we rely too much on the integrity of journalists. And so Julian Assange allowed us to see the data for ourselves. And this was a huge step forward for journalism and for whistleblowing. And it is for this reason that he is now being potentially extradited to the United States to face 175 years in a supermax prison, where he will be in a cell which is 10 feet by 8 feet at max, where he will be fed food once a day through a hatch, and where he will receive individual recreation, as the US beautifully puts it, by being allowed to go into a similar cell next door. And this for having committed no crime. He will be under these conditions also pre-trial, where he will be under something called, in a very sanitized way, special administrative measures and administrative segregation. Essentially, what they say is he will be allowed 2 phone calls a month of 15 minutes each to his family. All his calls, including to his lawyers, will be monitored. And the treatment that he will receive in order to deal with the tremendous psychological damage that has been done to him through years of smearing and isolation, both within the embassy and now for the last 2 years, despite winning his case in Belmarsh, will be to medicate him. And this is the kind of explanation that the CPS unflinchingly gives in saying that it's okay to extradite Julian to the United States. And we as citizens have to stand up against this, because of course, we are all horrified by the state's brutality towards Julian Assange as an individual, and the fact that 5 nation states, Britain, the US, Ecuador, Sweden, and Australia, intentionally and metaphorically stamped on his head in order to create the kind of psychological problems he is facing now. But also the physical torture they have caused. While he was in the Ecuadorian embassy, he had a shoulder injury. He had a very sore tooth, and he's had a chronic lung condition. And the British government didn't allow for him to even leave the embassy to have treatment at the hospital. In fact, Keir Starmer's CPS, and I'm ashamed to say this as a constituent in Keir Starmer's CLP, Keir Starmer's CPS wrote to the Swedish telling them, don't you dare get cold feet, this case is not being treated like other cases. And the only reason we know this is through freedom of information requests done by an Italian journalist, not by a British journalist while this was happening, but an Italian journalist who found out what was going on between Britain and Sweden in illegally and unlawfully keeping Julian's case in limbo and not giving justice either to the women in Sweden or to Julian, and continuing to smear and harass and taunt him while he was in the embassy. So in all of this, I guess I come back to what this is all about, and Eileen said it really succinctly. It's about the public interest. It's about us knowing the crimes that our governments and our corporations commit in our name. And WikiLeaks was the standard bearer for that. And it is important that we as a society coalesce around whistleblowers and around people like Julian, because they're on our side when our governments and these big corporations and their rich and powerful crony capitalists are not. I'd like to also, if I may, Andrew, invite you all to an international festival of dissent, whistleblowing and accountability, which is going to be on the 8th of May. It's a festival, so it's going to be fun. It's not going to be one long Zoom panel. We're going to have workshops, art, music, etc. It's going to be online. And I'm at @Deepa_driver on Twitter, and I will be putting out more information as we go along. I'm quite happy to answer any questions once others have had a chance to speak. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Deepa. I think it's quite remarkable to think about what one individual has done to support one of the most important whistleblowers of our time. And Deepa has done it in a way that has brought so many other people together to fight for Julian's basic human rights, to protect what it is that he has done for us all, and to end his suffering. I think we've been very privileged tonight. We started off by hearing from Eileen Chubb, originally of the Bupa 7. We have heard about the case of Julian and its contextual importance to all of us in the work that we do in whichever sector. And our final speaker, who it's a great pleasure to introduce, was a senior executive at the US National Security Agency, a US Air Force and Navy veteran, and a whistleblower who was charged under the US Espionage Act. It's an enormous pleasure for us to be able to welcome Tom Drake to this panel discussion, and Tom, to ask you to tell your story and to put it in the context of whistleblowing today.
Thank you, Andrew. And I really want to acknowledge all the other whistleblowers who have been on the panel today. My story is quite complex, but I'm going to summarize it in the space of probably 7 to 10 minutes. The fundamental question, though, is what would you sacrifice or give up to tell the truth? And when I say tell the truth, this is truth about power or of power. Power is a strange thing in society, especially if you hold it over others, especially if you have power in terms of an institution, especially if you have power with respect to the national security state. I was a part of a system that had enormous power. I was in the military twice. I even had a short stint where I was at the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency for the US. I spent a lot of time as a contractor as well, working on a whole myriad of very interesting projects, most of them in secret, but not all. And I had an opportunity to join NSA at a very senior level to make a difference. And when I say make a difference, the irony of NSA falling further and further behind with respect to the dynamics of the digital age. We've had the information age, going all the way back to Marconi and even earlier, but the digital age that emerged in the 1980s, and just the incredible acceleration in the volume and variety and velocity of data. My first day on the job was 9/11, interestingly enough, the day that I actually reported to my duty station after getting checked in and taking the oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States of America for the 4th time in my government career. And it's a piece of paper. It is an oath. I had taken it 3 times earlier, and I certainly wasn't going to break fidelity with the oath that I had taken. And here I was, leaving behind a very lucrative consulting business at the time, kind of giving up the freedoms that I had in sort of the go-go 90s and the internet age in the early aughts. And I'm joining NSA. And of course, I did not know that very early morning when I reported to the number 3 person at the National Security Agency what was about to happen within just a few short hours later that morning. But I knew that when the Twin Towers and then the Pentagon were hit, an extraordinary loss of life all at once, nearly 3,000 people that were murdered that day. I knew that the government, interestingly enough, had failed in providing for the common defense. This was never supposed to have happened. The National Security Act of 1947, in part, was established so we would never be surprised again, meaning a la surprised as in the attack by Japan on December 7th, 1941. And so this extraordinary Cold War era national security state, military industrial complex, which arose with great rapidity under Truman and then really Eisenhower presiding over it, and of course the intelligence complex. What most people did not know, very few people in fact knew, is that the failure to keep people out of harm's way led to some extraordinarily secret decisions at the highest levels of the government, up to and including the president. I became aware of those decisions made in the deepest of state secrecy. In fact, the secret of mass surveillance, in particular, mass surveillance as a regime that was rapidly being employed against the domestic side of the United States. The NSA had this vast, edifice to listen in on the communications of quote unquote other countries. Here, the power in the deepest of secret, is being turned on its own population. And I knew I could not stand by. If I did, I knew I'd be complicit in a crime committed by the government. I would be standing by and watching the subversion of the Constitution. And so I chose not to remain silent. I exercised moral agency at extraordinary risk. And I ended up blowing every whistle through every disclosure channel that existed, knowing that I would be exposed. I knew that internally. And so over a period of several years, I cooperated with a couple of investigations, Congress, the Department of Defense, and I began to experience in those intervening years, 2002, 2003, 2004, going into 2005, increasing retribution and retaliation. And I had one more place that I could go. I had one more place, and I've had extensive conversations with Daniel Ellsberg about this. I knew him when I was in very, very young teenager, when all that was breaking in the 71 to 73 timeframe with the Pentagon Papers. I knew what the risks were. I knew that Ellsberg, had been charged on the Espionage Act for the first time in American history for non-spy activities and for going to the press. And so I ultimately crossed the Rubicon, as we would say historically. I touched the third rail. I ultimately went to the press in the public interest, knowing that in doing so, that I would not only was putting my entire career at risk, but or worse, meaning I would probably lose my job, but the government was probably going to come after me. They were not going to take kindly to exposure of a state secret in which they were an abject violation of the rights of human beings, particularly when it came to the right to privacy. And that was just one of a number of things. Plus the utter failure to protect people, the cover-up of the intelligence failures of 9/11. And then the other part I blew the whistle on was the massive increase in spending after 9/11 to quote unquote fix the problem, meaning that we were going to spend billions and billions of dollars as if that was going to solve the big data problem. Just throw tons and tons of money at it, and guess where the money was going? To contractors. Those are the things I blew the whistle on. And so, no long story short, I found myself having my house raided in late 2007. I was ultimately I was under surveillance, electronic and physical. The government then spent the next several years figuring out a way to charge me. And guess what? Lo and behold, I ended up being indicted on the Espionage Act in April of 2010, facing 35 years in prison. So I paid an extraordinarily high price for speaking truth to and about power. I spent 14 months defending the very essence of who I was and my own integrity. Everything else was stripped aside. Huge cost, of course, and loss in my own personal life as well as my professional life, persona non grata. Ultimately, I was able to prevail. I did not go to trial. I did plead out to a minor misdemeanor for exceeding authorized use of computer under the proviso the government would drop all the felony charges against me, and I went free. And so I cannot tell you what it means, even to this day, after these years have gone by, what it means to be free. And what's also an extraordinary risk, that the whistleblowing, really, we are serving the public. We are the ones that are doing our best, in spite of extraordinary long odds, to hold power to account. And power is not going to let that easily give up or cede. They, obviously, especially if they're using that power to cover up crimes and wrongdoing and violations of the law, and then they have the same power to actually go after you. And of course, the Espionage Act is increasingly the equivalent of the Official Secrets Act in the United States, and it's become the go-to act to go after whistleblowers, to shut down dissent, to shut down anybody who dares to confront the state. And so it's really, where do you go, right? Well, you go to the public, in the public interest, because threats to public safety, health, wrongdoing, even at the highest levels of the government, it's important to call that out, even at extraordinarily high cost. Because what we're standing for is standing for a future in which we do not want power simply exercising that kind of abuse of power, but also the abuse in controlling others as well.
Thank you so much, Tom. For most of us, we can't begin to imagine what the experience must have been like. To really have to defend against your own country, which also happens to be the most powerful nation on the planet, as you put it, your very being, your very existence, everything that you stand for is incomprehensible. It is so important to hear your experience, to hear the integrity that drove your experience. And from the other side of the pond, where we are experiencing abuses by the state at an ever accelerating rate, it's really important to hear the story of people like yourself. And I hope that your message will inspire others to speak truth to power, and also to support those in our own country, like Julian Assange, who continue to suffer the consequences. We also should mention at this point Daniel Hale, the drone whistleblower, who is facing a very lengthy jail sentence for blowing the whistle on certain aspects of the US's, in my opinion, egregious drone campaign. Daniel, if you haven't seen it, appears in a remarkable film called National Bird. And again, is a very, very brave and courageous individual. And we as ordinary citizens can only thank those of you like Eileen, like Tom, like Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning, like Julian Assange, and so many of you who have made comments tonight about your own experiences attempting to blow the whistle. We can only give you our respect, and hopefully more and more going forward, our support. Thank you, Tom. Matt has now, I understand, according to Vicky, who has been behind the scenes operating everything, and thank you so much for that, Vicky. Matt has blown the whistle on his son, we believe, and has now either moved his location or his son's. And I have to say, Matt, that in a conversation like this, that is emotionally and intellectually extremely taxing, and we've seen just how taxing it is for so many people in the comments, it's actually good for a little bit of domestic reality to infiltrate what has been a difficult conversation. Thank you so much for managing to come back to us. Having now heard Tom and having heard what you heard before you had to leave us for a while, is there anything further that you would like to say to try and draw some of these things together as somebody who has decided to effectively turn your back on a potentially lucrative career in the commercial media, to hold power to account through your journalism?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to, just follow on a bit from what Tom said, because I think that it's important to understand that in our world at the moment, we are seeing a huge backlash against democracy across the world, against our civil and human rights by our own governments, from Brazil to the UK to the US. There's been countless pieces of legislation that this government are trying to bring in to really restrict our ability to show dissent, and that is conscious on the part of the people that rule over us. They don't want their priorities, which they want to project domestically and around the world, to be threatened by an uppity population. So there's things like in the UK, legislation being touted where there'd be a 10-year prison sentence for taking part in a demonstration which is deemed annoying. I mean, this sounds like something out of a Soviet Union or something. I mean, these things are happening, and it's a weekly sort of thing. They keep that they recently proposed giving immunity for all UK soldiers for issues of torture, and obviously, a part of all that is whistleblowing, because whistleblowers are the frontline defenders of democracy. They are the ones that are letting us know information from the inside which the state doesn't want to know, and they are the ones that come under the most concerted attack, because the state and corporations want to stop that information line existing. And Tom talked about the ferocity with which the NSA and the US state took action against him, raiding his house, threatening him with 35 years in jail. These are all performative attacks on someone like Tom to send a message that people inside should not do this, and you don't want to do this. It's not good for you. And it's the same with Assange, the journalists. I mean, we have a journalist. He is a whistleblower, but essentially he's the other end of the leaking dynamic, and he's sitting now 2 years in Belmarsh prison, maximum security prison, alongside terrorists, paedophiles, all the worst dregs of humanity, or dregs of the United Kingdom. He's sitting there, and he is being threatened with 175 years in the US. I mean, his life, he's never going to be able to have a normal life, and they want him to send a message to everyone else: do not mess with us. And we need to understand and support whistleblowers at every stage, because we need to create conditions where people do not see it as life ending to take the moral step and blow the whistle, because someone like Edward Snowden really definitely upsets the national security state, because he's living a life in Russia which is not a bad life. I mean, it's obviously has massive restrictions, but they would have wanted him to spend the rest of his life in solitary confinement in the US, in some supermax in the desert, but that didn't happen. And so we need more of those occasions. And what is vital is that we create an infrastructure for whistleblowers that can combat the state's persecution, because what at the moment we have is a huge imbalance of power. When a whistleblower comes forward, they take on these huge institutions, these huge states that want to destroy them, and there's very little on the other side that protects them. People like Eileen are trying to fill that hole and doing it amazingly, but that needs to really be, that should be our goal, to develop it. There needs to be a whole infrastructure which is the natural place for a whistleblower to go, i.e. they can get pro bono legal advice even before they blow the whistle. They can get pro bono advice about how to approach the media safely. All these things need to be in place. And the reason it's slow to get there is because the state really doesn't want that in place, because they don't want a competitor in this. They want to be able to smash people as soon as they raise their head above the parapet. So I think, in conclusion, we need to understand that this is democracy at stake, and these people are the frontline defenders, and we should support them every step of the way. And as Deepa said, there's all sorts of mechanisms through which they try and destroy them. It's not just the legal threats, it's not just the raiding the house, it's also reputational destruction, which they do in much more insidious ways, and all sorts. There's a whole playbook that they've got. So we need to not play their game in that sense. And I'll just finish with, obviously, as a journalist, I can provide some sense from the journalist side of what it's like working with whistleblowers, and I've seen countless times what people or what Tom and Eileen have talked about, which is the awful personal impact often that this has, and that's by design. They want to make it hard to do. And I wrote a book about the US military, and particularly about the proliferation of neo-Nazis and gang members and criminals in the US military after during the early stage of the war on terror, because they couldn't recruit enough soldiers, and they actively or stopped enforcing regulations on those categories. And I talked to, and every single whistleblower I talked to had their life destroyed, and had no help rebuilding their lives. And that is a story that we don't often hear, that people need to understand is a major part of the way that the state stops people coming forward. Because, as I said earlier, whistleblowers pose a strategic threat to the national security state, and actually, if you look at the numbers of people involved in this machine in the US and the UK, we're talking millions of people. It is surprising, really, that so few come forward and have a crisis of conscience and make that step. And the reason is that you risk everything. There is the chance that you would spend the rest of your life in jail, or have everything you own taken away from you, your family life destroyed. All these things stop people coming forward. So our goal as defenders of democracy and defenders of human rights is to create an infrastructure for these people going forward, whereby you can live a normal life and you can be celebrated as the hero that you are after you blow the whistle.
Thanks so much, Matt. I am aware that we should be closing now, but for those of you who are able to stay with us a few minutes longer, I would like to just pose a couple of the questions that have been posed by members of the audience to the panelists. I'm afraid I'm only going to be able to give the panelists a minute or so to answer any of the questions or anything else that has come up that you would like to comment on. But thank you so much for a wonderful breadth and range of great questions, and our apologies that we can only ask so few of them. Julius says that he's actually going to submit 2 questions to a key workers summit tomorrow, organized by Southwest TUC, which could equally be addressed to the panel. And the first is, how can an effective whistleblowing system be created for NHS staff and other key workers, especially in care services, bearing in mind very few staff appear to have any confidence in the confidentiality of whistleblowing systems established by management in their own organizations? And the second question, and unfortunately mine gets cut here, how can NHS staff and key workers be protected from what I think is from bullying? So I would imagine that there are a couple of you who would particularly be interested in taking on that question. There has then been a question from Karima on YouTube, who is listening in from France. She has a question about transposing the European Whistleblower Directive in the UK, whether the UK also has to transpose this more protective directive for whistleblowers, and I would imagine that Brexit becomes something of an issue there, but one or more of you might have something to say on that. And then there was a comment, I think, also on YouTube, asking really about whether there are any known good examples of people speaking up and creating change. And I would like the panelists to try and end on that, if possible, in your minute or so, based on the realization of the last comment or question, that I actually spent 5 hours this morning in a consultation with prosecutors from South Africa's National Prosecuting Authority in preparation for giving evidence against the country's former president, Jacob Zuma, in his corruption trial in relation to the arms deal that I tried to investigate almost 20 years ago. His corruption trial starts in mid-May. And I would like to think that all of those people who spoke up, and they included people within my own party, the ANC, within the military establishment, who spoke up about the corruption, feel very positively the fact that someone who was recently the most powerful person in the country politically will soon be in the dock facing the full might of the law for his corruption because of their speaking up. Shall we just go through the panel as you spoke initially? And please feel free to comment on any of those questions that you feel enabled to, and any other thoughts that you have, particularly on the issue of people speaking up and creating change. Eileen?
Hi, try and keep it a thing. Regarding good examples of whistleblowing, there's two kinds of whistleblowing. There's the convenient and there's the inconvenient information. And that has to be recognised in law, that if you're telling a company that someone's stealing their money, they're very welcome. They welcome that information with open arms. There's the positive examples. However, if you're raising concerns that the company are defrauding money, etc., that information is treated in a totally different way, and the law needs to recognise that. It's no good saying to employers, don't be naughty to whistleblowers, because that doesn't work. The second question, I've forgotten what the second question was. Regarding good examples, as in, I think tonight is a good example. You know, whistleblowers have come forward, they've raised serious concerns about an organisation, and thanks to Truth Defence and Shadow World, that information is out there in the public and they've been made aware of it. I don't think you could end with a better or positive example when the truth prevails as it has tonight. And thank you to all the other speakers. You've been amazing.
Thanks so much, Eileen. Matt?
I mean, on the big question of examples of people who have changed things, it's happening every day. People are blowing the whistle. There is a steady stream of people speaking out against what's happening, and I think we're going to see more and more of it, because we're going to a very dark place as a world. And I mean, there's people like Snowden, Tom, in the sort of field that I look at, national security. But there's also on the journalist side, heroes as well, because what we have to understand is that although in civics class, the media is presented as this a noble fourth estate that holds power to account, it's mostly hot air. And in fact, the media operates often as an arm of the state. And it is actually very hard for a lot of these important whistleblowers to get their information out. One, because there's no journalists that they can trust. And two, because the papers that they go to are co-opted by the very forces that they're exposing. So I think people like Glenn Greenwald, who was one of the reporters who worked on the Snowden documents, and subsequently did a huge expose of the corruptions program in Brazil, which showed it was itself corrupt, and basically freed Lula from prison. People like him have had have literally made the world a better place through their journalism, and obviously the whistleblowers who worked on those stories, the same thing. So you're seeing it all the time. We need to understand that the media is not our friend. I think the mainstream media, I think it is actually our enemy, and either we need to change the media to make it do what it should do, which is treat these whistleblowers as sources and protect them as such, or we need to develop alternative media more so we can create the infrastructure where we can cover leaks such as Snowden or Chelsea Manning. Yeah, I'll finish by just saying, aside from the work itself, every time someone like Tom, Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning comes out, they're changing the world, not just by what they're revealing, but changing the world by their example. And that's very important, because people look to people who have had a crisis of conscience, and first they gain strength and they gain courage, and it changes people's it's a massive rupture in what is a smooth process and a smooth machine when you see someone come out like that, and it inspires people. And it's not literal in the sense that tomorrow someone's going to come out, but a slow burn over many years, when people working inside these institutions, which are often doing bad things, are seeing people have a crisis of conscience, it gradually sort of grinds down on them, and it might at some stage have the effect of them being the next whistleblower. So yeah, I think it's optimistic. We just need to be wary of the backlash, which is already happening and is going to get worse.
Thanks so much, Matt. Deepa?
I think Matt is right in saying that courage is contagious, and it is really important for us to recognize that in each of us educating ourselves about the criminality of Britain and America, the imperialism, the stamping down on Black lives, whether they are in America or through slavery or in Iraq and Afghanistan, the understanding of what's happening when large corporations dump toxic waste off the Ivory Coast. These are all small steps towards changing the world. And one of your listeners asked, where do we see a positive example? You see it in the Arab Spring, in the information that WikiLeaks revealed that led to a change of government in Tunisia, that led to changes in how the Iraqi parliament provided immunity for American soldiers, in the changes that we have seen, at least in my personal level. I'm an academic who was before that a banker and a regulator, crossed over from the dark side, and I never thought that national security stuff would even be interesting to me. Or what WikiLeaks did, it was interesting in the background, but as you are listening and as we are speaking, we are all educating ourselves and creating a community where we respect and safeguard people like Tom and people like Chelsea and people like Julian, in order that we can have a better society. And there are 3 or 4 ways in which governments stamp down on these kinds of people, and this is what we have to be careful of. Number one, they smear or muckrake through very well-networked organizations like Stratfor, which public relations consultants, those kinds of companies. They plant false narratives in mainstream newspapers. So they say, oh yes, we're going into Afghanistan to liberate the women there. Or they co-opt some legitimate civil society actors, people who are supposed to be safeguarding our interests, whether they are an APPG or whether they are an advocacy body of some sort, and plant people there. And lastly, they use techniques such as lawfare, but not just visible lawfare through taking it through the court, but invisible lawfare through reductions in information provided through Freedom of Information report. I've received Freedom of Information requests where I've got 30 pages and there is hardly one word across those 30 pages that is not blacked out. So this kind of thing must be stamped on, and as we as citizens, as long as we sit back and take this kind of behavior, we will continue to have the kinds of governments and the kinds of political actors that we have. But the minute we are the many, we are together, and we are the 99%, and we need to hold the elites and the 1% to account for how they are destroying and destroying our world. So I'd urge you to take the agency and take power in your own hands, work with your trade union, work with your local community group.
Thank you so much for that, Deepa. Tom?
Yeah, there's a lot at stake. And I think one of the things I'm left with as we finish up this panel discussion is I've called it the de-evolution of democracy worldwide. The trend lines have not been really positive over the last number of years. Sort of the rise of autocracy, the rise of authoritarianism, the kind, power's not going to give up. And I don't know, it's corporate power, whether it's state power, and everything else in between. One of the things that is really crucial going forward, and there have certainly been a number of proposals, some have actually gone forward more formally, is whistleblower rights. Meaning it's one thing to blow the whistle, but if you, and even there are laws, even in the United States, that quote unquote give whistleblowers certain rights, but rights without a remedy really is as a paper tiger. And I think I'll speak to the United States perspective when it comes to whistleblowing, especially inside the formal structures of power, is the access to the courts. And in fact, that it's possible to have a public interest defense. One of the things that's been run over, roughshod, is if it's national security, that somehow there's this exemption. If it's national security, that takes primacy over rule of law. And in fact, I would argue that national security is increasingly taking the place of law as sort of the shadow rule. Those trend lines are not good. However, in terms of differences, well, in some ways, this very panel is a demonstration of that. But even in the United States, just recently a bill was introduced, which has been referred to as the Fourth Amendment is not for sale. The right to privacy, the right to be left alone, the fact that you need a warrant. And it's been triggered, ironically enough, and there's bipartisan support for it, significant bipartisan support, is it turns out that there's third-party companies, non-governmental entities, corporations, where the government has been using their relationships, which is part of my own whistleblowing, in which they sell or provide, and they certainly are not doing it for free, data on huge amounts of data on people and persons and who we are and all of our digital transactions, and selling it back to the government. Well, wait a minute, whose data is that? And so the fundamental question I ask in all of this is, what future do we want to keep? And that ultimately comes down to, and this is the phrase that resonates with me as an American, is, it's for who? For we the people. And it comes down to, it's we the people all over the world. And I think I'm increasingly encouraged with all the challenges we face, with all the disruptions that we've seen, even in the past year with the pandemic. People are not whistleblowing. People are whistleblowing. People are coming forward. Courage is contagious, and the need to stand up and speak out against those who would dare take our rights away, who would dare take away our commons, who would dare have exercise abuse of power and social control over us. This is the role of the whistleblower. And so we really are speaking to a future in the present that we want to have for everybody. Too many of us have seen a future that's quite dystopian. I don't want to have people go through what I went through. And so part of this is our own common humanity, and doing so together.
Thank you so much for that, Tom, and thank you to all four of you for extraordinarily informative, but at the same time inspiring input during the course of this discussion. Thank you so much to all of you who have listened in, who have participated with your comments, your questions. For those of you who are whistleblowers, you have heard about some of the organizations of support I cannot recommend highly enough: Compassion and Care and The Whistler. And I think the integrity of the organizations shines through in everything that Eileen has said. I would ask you to please read the report that Truth Defense and SWI have published earlier today. Let us know any further research that you feel should be done on this crucial issue, any of your thoughts on how whistleblowers can be better supported. I would also like to thank those who organized this event, Justin, Vicky, Rona, and all others who have contributed to the report and to setting up and promoting this event. I would like to leave you with the words of another wonderful campaigning journalist, Chris Hedges, who I was fortunate enough to interview for the film of The Shadow World. Chris, in turn, quoted Julian Bender in The Treason of Intellectuals, who said, "You can serve two sets of principles, privilege and power, or justice and truth. The more you make compromises with those who serve privilege and power, the more you diminish the capacity for justice and truth. I think that the rebel seeks to keep those who have power fearful. The rebel decides just to be a giant pain in the ass. There are enough of us involved tonight, involved in terms of the people we have spoken about and their support structures, to make a difference to the countries we live in, to the worlds we live in. Our democracies exist to serve us, the citizens of those democracies. Let us do everything we can to make them more transparent, more honest, more just, and more equal for all. Thank you so much for your participation tonight. We wish you strength, courage, peace, and health. Good night.